Aperture.
Please join me in welcoming Joel Meyerowitz.
Thank you, Denise. And thank Aperture for hosting this and publishing this book and other books of mine. I want to thank Michael Famighetti and Jenny Goldberg, who used to be the head of my archive, because this work that I'll be showing tonight would not be in a book if it wasn't for the two of them. Michael was looking for some work about style, and Jenny had a sense that in the archive there were hundreds of large format portraits I had made in Provincetown in the 80s. And so she made her own selection and sent 250 pictures to Michael for the magazine. And when Michael saw the photographs, he thought, the images here and the people here and the style here are sort of on the leading edge of what we are living with today in terms of gender issues and all of that combined. And he felt that it was the right time to bring these pictures out and make a book. So it never would have been published. If it was up to me, it would have been in the archive, overlooked. So in a way, one has to thank the inspiration of other people to look at the work in a fresh way and bring it back to life. So I am really grateful. Jenny, are you here? Well, there's a seat up here in the front if you want it. Anyway, what I'd like to say is, like, this is our opportunity to spend some time together, an hour more or less. And I've never given this talk before. I just made this show up yesterday. And so it's new to me too. But if questions come up while we're talking, turn off your phones, please. If questions come up, please feel free to call out and ask. I'm happy to stop and respond to the question. That way we can have a real interaction together. And it'll be more like a conversation rather than a talk just from my side. Are we agreed? Would you be louder? Do you hear me now? See, it's very loud on me when I put my mouth right here. Okay, I'll do that. Thank you for asking. So if you do have a question, please just ask and I'll respond. Okay. Well, let me tell you a little bit about this work before I begin. In 1976, I was going through a change in my work. As a street photographer, shooting color, I felt that I needed to make images with greater descriptive quality. And it seemed to me that even though Kodachrome was a gorgeous material to work with, I needed something that would allow me to make prints that would be 6 feet, 8 feet across. And so I made a leap of faith and bought an 8x10 view camera, never having used one before. And a good friend of mine said, why don't you spend the summer in Provincetown, Massachusetts? It has great street life. It's an interesting community at the very tip of Cape Cod. It's a kind of Land's End where people go to get away from it all and to really express themselves. And so I took his advice and I rented a house there for the summer. And I learned how to use an 8x10 camera during that time. And in that first year, in the first summer, I made mostly photographs of the landscape and the light and the space of the place. But along the way, I made 1 or 2 portraits. And it felt very different to me than making street portraits, which happen in such an instantaneous way that there's really no contact. There's no sense of intimacy or sharing anything. It's a hit and run kind of way of working. So those 2 portraits that I made that managed to stay on the wall over my desk for a whole year, and everything else would change, but those two portraits were there. And a year later, I thought, these two pictures are speaking to me. They're telling me that there's something here to investigate. And for me, photography has always been a thrilling medium to work with because it raises questions about our identity, our values. It raises questions about the medium itself. How do you use it to say what you want to say? And so I was provoked by those couple of pictures, and the next year or so, I made a greater effort to try to understand what a portrait is. Now, I know we're all living in the portrait world right now. Everybody with a smartphone makes portraits all the time, whether it's family, friends, your animals, your babies. It's the lingua franca of photography right now. And so to have a book of portraits come out at this moment to deal with these issues that were, for me, very exciting 40 years ago when I made them, almost 40 years ago, it's kind of a revelation. And I'll begin now by going backwards a little bit. Did you say the top one? No, the bottom one was forward. Okay, so what I wanted to do was show a few photographs of street portraits that I made when I first began, 1962 and 63, some of these pictures. And at that point, you know, I was learning how to use the camera, and I wanted to see how close I could get to people. Could I break through the shyness that I had as a natural instinct? And who would be my subject? What kind of people attracted me? How close could I get to somebody and be in their space? And you know, what does a picture look like? I was so new, I was such a novice at that point that I was really experimenting with these values and these characteristics. Actually, if you read this, you realize this woman in 1963 was really talking about our time today. A camera could go through the hollow of a hollow needle. Soon, Big Brother may be able, I mean, imagine that, walking around town carrying this sign everywhere, warning us about the future. So these kind of pictures, although they were interesting and charming and spontaneous at the time, really aren't about portraits in the way that I learned a portrait can be made. Because there's something about the intimacy of being with another person, of selecting another person. And my behavior usually would be to just carry my view camera on my shoulder, as if it was a big 35mm camera, and walk up and down the streets or beaches of Cape Cod. And if somebody had a kind of a pulse, some kind of a vibration that spoke to me, as if I identified something of myself in the other, I would cross that social distance and say to them, I need to make a portrait of you. It's very simple. You know, my need was my need, and if they would be willing to do it, we'd make a portrait right there, wherever we were. And I can't remember anybody ever saying no, and I don't think it was my personal charm as much as it was a 6-foot-tall wooden camera, you know, from early in the century that made people think, oh, what is this? This is strange. And they would yield, I believe, to that. So my method, really, when I would meet somebody that seemed of interest to me, they generally would say, oh, what should I do? What do you want me to do? And I didn't want to direct anybody. During those years, I was making a living as an advertising photographer to support myself, because photography had, you know, a very small gallery system, and prices were, you know, you could buy a picture of mine for $100. So You couldn't live on that. So advertising was that. And in advertising, there's a lot of direction and control. But I didn't want that to be in these pictures, so I would say to most people, make yourself comfortable. Whatever it is that they did, whatever gesture or position was enough to start me on my way to making a photograph. So for instance, this young woman was coming down the street, and it's sort of near dusk, a little early still, and I just saw her colors and the way she was walking, and I saw that bandana, that scarf wrapped around her waist, and I saw the braid, and I thought, well, this is part of the content of this photograph. So just to see her that way, and my sense was that in order to communicate with somebody and to maybe get something that wasn't just visually, graphically interesting, but that might show something of the human being who attracted me in the first place, I needed to also, understand that there were other things in the photograph. It's not just the face. This guy was just standing on the street corner, waiting for somebody, I guess, and that incredible tattoo. And when I went over to ask him if I could photograph him, and there was no from him, I then looked and saw that the way that shirt was tucked in, and the tear, and the cigarette, are essential elements in describing the kind of intimacy that we were having in that moment. He may be relating directly to me, but I'm seeing all of this person so that it's not just the face alone. They seem to me to be out of an Alice in Wonderland-like story, these two women, the way they came down the street. And, it's an experiment all the time. Also, one of the stresses of working with a large camera, which isn't like our digital machines of today where we can change the exposure or the film's values. This is a long time exposure. It's like a 3-second exposure. You're asking people to stand still the way they might have in the 19th century without moving, and you have to trust that something in this exchange between them and me will carry some of the magic of the moment or the mystery of the moment. Just one shot of each? Yes, my sense was, and I once had an argument with Richard Avedon about this, because Dick would shoot 70, 80, 90 frames, because he had assistants there and he had no seam out in the West or in the studio. But I'm a street photographer, and you try to get it in a frame, right? The moment happens, and you want that moment at its peak to be the important moment. And I think I trained myself to observe these people, and when that moment seemed to solidify in some way, and I managed to keep a conversation going with people as I set the camera up, because don't forget we're seeing it upside down, and find the right position. And it takes 2 or 3 minutes to get it all established. And in the course of that time, in order to hold on to the attention of the subjects, it's important to keep something going on between us. Not chit-chat, but something that keeps me in tune with whoever they are, as a couple or as an individual, so that I can keep reading them in order to think that I'm getting closer in terms of a sense of intimacy with people. Because it's a fiction. It's all in your mind. They're still separate, and they're themselves, and they're going to do anything they want when you press the shutter button. But I needed to feel as if I had the fish on the line, and I was keeping that line just taut enough so that when they had finally yielded something of their mystery to me, because I think we're all a mystery, and it's worth hoping that you can, through your connection with them, bring this mystery to the moment, so that when they, because with a 35 millimeter camera, you're looking through the finder of the camera at the action. With a view camera, after you focus the camera and put the film in, you step aside. I step aside. And so I'm off here, and they're over here looking into the camera, and I'm watching them deliver whatever they have to give. And so I have to sort of pounce when the moment is right, when I think that their vulnerability, their openness, their inner light, sorry to be corny, but when I think I see that, I release the shutter, and usually it's a half a second, sometimes 3 seconds. So that's a long time to live through an exposure. So it's very challenging, but it's also incredibly rewarding, because you see so much when you make your print. It's all there, and that part is magical. The thing is, I never know who is going to be a reflection of some sense I might have about myself. It's risky the same way street photography is risky, because then you have to interact with people and get them to come to some place that is interesting, photographically interesting. And really the fact that I never posed anybody, that people do this on their own. You say, make yourself comfortable. That's comfortable to somebody. They make a pretzel out of their relationship. And so you witness them doing this, and you think, God, what a gift. I could never have told them to do that. I think, as we all know, a lot of photographers here, I'm assuming, we all know that part of the joy of seeing is the surprises we get, right? People do unexpected things right in front of us. They reveal, hidden qualities of themselves or of modern life. And we, as readers of the text of today, trying to be contemporary in our values and our visions, we think that's important right now. And we go for it, make the picture at that moment. And even with a view camera, that plays out. I guess what's surprising is that over the number of years I worked on the Cape, I probably made well over 1,000 portraits of total strangers, view camera portraits. So the collection was, had such variety from sometimes infants. Try to photograph an infant with an 8x10 camera. When you find one that's really interesting and it's got character already at 9 months, and suddenly it's not just a cute picture of a kid, but it is a human being at that stage, and they're full of their life, and they're sitting there for me with a big camera. There are wonders. For instance, this woman was a fisherwoman that I knew, who managed to take her eye out with a hook. But when she was standing for the picture, I noticed that her nerves were such that she was digging this knife into her thumb. And, I said, stay, Sam, stay as you are. Because I saw the detail. And I think that's part of the... Anyway, it's little details like that. And really, when I find myself standing with a stranger and trying to observe everything, the way their clothes fit them, the wrinkles, the pulls, the neckline, all of these things, which I learned from a lot of August Sonder photographs, the way the clothing fit the people. You know those two boxers of August Sanders? The way,
It's in my bedroom.
It's in your bedroom. Well, the way that the pants fit that guy, right? So that sort of stimulated me to consider the way we look in our clothing and how it does its own thing on us. And so all these details are important. You know, they may seem secondary, but they're really important to the making of the picture. I'll be honest with you. One summer when I realized that I wanted a lot of people to be coming through my experience in a way, and I couldn't just go out and fish all day long, so I fished by putting an ad in the local Provincetown paper, and it said, "Remarkable people. If you are remarkable or know someone who is, scars, birthmarks, freckles, red hair, Joel Meyerowitz wants to make a photograph of you." Well, the most ordinary people came through saying, "I'm remarkable because I got this scar here." Anyway, it was wonderful. I photographed everybody who came because if they thought they were remarkable, then they were. And so this woman shows up on the deck one day, and she was beautiful to me, you know. And as we were standing there, her lipstick separated. Just the tackiness of it somehow just gave way, and I saw this little opening into her mouth. And for me, that was the photograph. I could have said, "Oh, you know, close your lip," but no, it was a flaw. In a sense, in the beauty of this young woman, that little flaw became interesting to me. I made the picture on the flaw.
You would only spend like 2 minutes with each person?
No, but it was probably a little longer than that because someone comes, you have to have your own humanity with them and be engaged. Who are you? What do you do? Why are you here? What's so remarkable about you? Sharing something together is part of what makes photography interesting. I mean, as a street photographer, I almost never spoke to anybody, right? It's duck and cover. It's moving through the crowd, trying to stay invisible. But what happened to me on Cape Cod was that carrying this 6-foot wooden box around, people saw me, and suddenly I was no longer invisible. It's not like having a Leica slip in and out of my across my face. And so I had to engage and learn how to do that. And I thought, I feel very strongly about the human interaction. I like it when somebody wants to get close or to share something or is willing to come out of anonymity into my space and share themselves with me. And I think it really, it was a very special period of work to have all these strangers come into my life and be willing to share that kind of tenderness together.
Was there an opportunity for the people to see the images in the summers? Or
If they came back, I usually brought pictures with me. I never promised anybody a photograph, but I took everybody's name and address so that, should I need to publish a book, I would reach them and I would then give them a photograph. If people wanted a print, and felt that their offer to me of themselves was worth that, I would do it. I honored their, concerns. It's only, at that point it was just a portrait of somebody, and we gave each other something, so I would happily give back.
did you have a lab there, or were you processing this?
No, I had a lab there. No, I processed the film in New York, but I had a lab in Orleans, which was, half an hour away from Provincetown, and I often would go there to print, you know, wet prints of the day. My daughter, here, at that moment, at that vulnerable, transformational moment in her life, and it was interesting to me. Can I talk about this? Sure, why not? Go ahead, Pop. Say whatever you want to say. Embarrass me in front of everybody. You know, my daughter was going through that change from girl to young womanhood, you know, and that transformation as a parent was really remarkable to see. And with my son too. And so during this period of Ariel's life, I made lots of photographs of her and of her friends so that I could actually see what it looked like to hold on to this evanescent moment where the child is transforming into the woman to be. And, you know, I probably have 50 pictures of Ariel from this period in the crazy secondhand clothes she bought, some boots with rhinestones. Her paper route provided her with just enough money to buy some really weird stuff. I loved it when she came home. Anyway, it also offered me an opportunity to look around at that age group to see what it looked like, you know, from a man's point of view, to really look at emerging women and try to understand something, and maybe even understand about how society evolves. This young woman, I have other pictures of her with her mother, and there was something going on between them, a kind of, how could I say it? From my perspective, the mother was clinging to the daughter, to that youth and beauty and innocence. And the mother, who was an attractive woman herself and also a redhead, but was already the mother, and she was moving on. And the way she related to her daughter, I made several photographs of them over the course of a summer, because every time I saw them, there was a kind of strange intimacy between them coming from the mother. So I was happy to have the daughter separately one time to see who she is. This woman came, she said, I'm remarkably, I have 6 toes. and she said, see, my stockings always tear because of that extra toe. So the picture took this shape. When I said, make yourself comfortable, she climbed up on this railing. Now, that wouldn't have been my choice for comfortable, but it suited her. Is he the perfect professor or what? Down from Harvard for the weekend or from MIT? Going to look for whales with my telescope. What is this formula on his chest? Does anybody know? Or what is X? It's not that funny. You have to break your neck to get one of those. This was a friend of mine from Boston who had a house on the pond in Wellfleet, and he came down from his job in his suit for his 50th birthday party on the pond. And I was there ahead of him. You know, everybody was sort of going to surprise him. And I said, Rick, I want to make you a picture for your birthday. He said, well, what would you like to do? I said, you look great right now. Why don't you go into the pond? He just took off his pants and he walked into the pond. And it seemed perfect to me, you know, for this guy who I used to swim long distance across the pond with him. And for him to be in his suit was just, I don't know, it seemed funny at the time. And then, so as luck would have it, you probably won't believe this guy's name is Joel Cobb. No shit. And he was going to some costume party, and he was walking through this yard from one street to another, the only cornfield in Provincetown, in someone's backyard, and I happened to be there at the moment. I didn't bring him to it. We met there by chance. Now, that's street photography with a view camera. Wow. I love the part down below where he's got all the corn stalks up there. No hips. I was walking back from shooting in Provincetown, going back to my place, and he was out on the edge here doing his ballet practice. And I just stood and watched him for 3 or 4 minutes, just all of his twists and bends and you know, almost on point, barefoot. And I just thought, this guy's remarkable. I'm going to go and ask if I can make his photograph. And in his case, I made 2, because after I made this picture, and I wanted to write it up, because I kept a log on every photograph I made. I took names and addresses. I wrote about the color of the light and whatever materials were around, because I wanted to make prints. I did all my own printing in those days, contact printing. I wanted to make prints that had the authority of the reality of that moment. And I didn't want to fake it. Make it a little redder, make it a little pinker, make it a little cooler. I wanted it to be what it was that I saw, because sometimes there were remarkable light conditions. And I felt if I can get you to trust my values and my seeing, that I would be able to go ever more subtly into the things that I was photographing, and that you would believe that they weren't tricks, that they were the reality itself. And I still have all of these logs that we've entered into our database, but I have the boards that I wrote them on with the dates and the exposures and all of that stuff. You know, maybe this works for everybody, I don't know, but sometimes I found myself mythologizing the people I was with. Like, this guy, you know, came into my place to be photographed, and his spirit was like a fawn in the woods. And I wasn't in the woods. I was, the only thing I had was this little tree in the front yard. But I felt him to be one of those creatures in the woods in the dappled light, you know, like a magical creature. And so I said, well, let's go over here because the light's nice over here. And it was he who knelt down like that and in this kind of prayerful way with the dappled light. And his sweetness, you know, spoke to me that way. And, you know, somehow I find it useful, emotionally useful, to cast the people I photograph, not all the time, but sometimes, see in them some quiver of this mythology, you know, something that reminds me of a spirit world that they might have inhabited at some point. And, you know, we're all crazy in our own way, let's face it. And whatever you use to enliven your connection to place or people or light or space, this is your private vocabulary. And if you don't trust that, then you might not benefit from it. And so I always let myself have these waking dreams so that I stay in some kind of connection to them. Works for me. This was one of the very first portraits that I made on the Cape. This woman is a famous art historian, now dead, and she was living next door. And she came over for a visit, and we were just sitting around talking, and I thought, oh, I should make a portrait of her and her daughter. And I said, I'm going to do this, Linda. And she said, well, what should we do? I said, I don't know, find a place where you can be together. And they sat down, and we were talking. And then I noticed that Linda's hand had come to this kind of, Zen position, and her daughter was fidgety, as a 12 or 13-year-old might be. And when I saw this kind of tenderness and insecurity, I said, no, stay like that. And I made the picture. And then when I was back in New York, I printed it, and I had a book of August Saunders' photographs, men of the 20th century. And I opened the book up, and I searched through it, and I came across a photograph of a mother and son, about the same age. And my print was exactly the same size, 8 by 10, as the Sonder picture in the book. And I put my picture next to the Sonder. For me, it was an homage to a master, but it was also to test, does my picture, does it have any of these qualities, any values? I think it's important to always test yourself against your maître. You have to go and pay homage in that way. And the other day in the studio, I came across the Sonder book, and I flipped through it, and there was the picture. And I hadn't taken it out in 40 years. And it was sitting there, and it stunned me, because all these black and white pictures, and here was my color photograph. Anyway, I think it's part of the learning curve. When you embark on something new, it's important to have reverence for those that came before you and who lit the way for us to find our own sense of values and our own methods that serve us in our time. Ah, there's the mother and daughter, yeah. So I should mention, this is a book of around 100 portraits. And I felt I didn't want to just put portrait after portrait after portrait. I felt that I should break the book up into some kinds of sections so that there was a flow. I did some couples, I did single men and women, I have mothers and daughters as a section. There's a section coming up that is partially odalisques, reclining figures. I tried to find within the work, which hadn't been calculated beforehand, it was just work. But sometimes the work produces its own systems within the larger system. And if you can discover that about yourself, that you were actually hitting on parents and mothers and daughters, or you were hitting on reclining figures, or on whatever it is that is your magnetic north in your work, it's useful. It helps give the work a kind of dimension. Otherwise, it's just photographs, and that have nothing to do with each other except they were made in Provincetown. So, and I remember, can you see it very well here? Well, it's not as clear on the screen because of the projection, but the light had just gone behind the buildings, and there was only one last bit of sunlight, which was cascading over the young girl's shoulder across her chest. And the tenderness of that light and the youthful beauty of her skin and her innocence next to her mother, who's already a worldly person who has had her day, though that little bit of, crossover with the light sort of gilding it, embellishing it a little bit, was for me the essence of the picture. Even though it was about two people, somehow the caress of the light meant a lot to me. Small thing. Excuse me? As Ariel would tell you probably, he carried the camera with him everywhere he went. If he went to the A&P, if he went to the beach, if he went I always carried the camera because really, in my mind, as a street photographer, I never leave without my camera. It's always on my shoulder. Not now, I'm talking, but when I'm walking, I carry a camera. And I did the same thing with the 8x10 because I didn't want to miss anything. Whatever surprised me was another opportunity to see the world from the perspective of a large format camera, but to sort of open myself up to new possibilities. It's a wonderful game, the game of seeing. And if you don't have your camera, there are moments when you feel, I don't know, at a loss, as if, why did I leave it at home? Mother and daughters. This guy was covered in plastic fruit. And he was one of those guys that in medieval times he would have been a busker someplace, a musician, a speechifier, an acrobat, something. He had that kind of wiry, mad energy. And they were walking on the beach right underneath my deck. And I saw him go by with all this crazy stuff on him. And I called out. So he came up. And when again, they asked, I said, well, whatever you want, make yourself comfortable. And they too wove themselves into this position. It just, I probably have 50 pictures of people turning themselves into these kind of human knots together. And it's hilarious. It's beautiful too, the colors. Her leggings and her shorts and her shirt and all of it was just beautiful to me. So intense. This is Norman Mailer, who everybody knows as such a tough guy and such a bastard and so difficult. But here he is with his, I don't know, 5th child, 6th child, this little John Buffalo. And he was as tender and gentle with this child as any other person. And I saw that side of him. He was a neighbor, so I saw a lot of him. And he was beautiful. Now, one morning, I come out on the deck to go down the flight of stairs to go for a swim. And at the foot of the stairs is this woman sitting there, just like that. And I think, oh my God, I got to get the camera. So I go back and bring the camera, and although she's sitting still, the waves are rocking her back and forth. So I'm thinking, how am I going to make this exposure? And then I looked carefully and I watched how the sunlight was dancing against her elbow, and the water had light writing on it, this kind of crazy calligraphy. And I thought, oh, that's the picture. She's there, even if she moves with the water. What really is important to me is that this little magical occurrence might happen again. So, it did. It's my son, Sasha. This is Jack Pearson, who wasn't Jack Pearson then. He was John somebody, but he became Jack Pearson later on. It's my plumber. If his work was only as straight as his posture, he was so high most of the time that if he was able to get the joint and this pipe screwed together, I was grateful. So she changed bathing suits during the vacation. So, you know, seeing people on the beach sometimes reminded me of the kind of odalisque pose you would often see in Matisse paintings, for example. And I thought, I'll try that. It's beguiling in some way. Even guys do it. I said to him, this was a traveling circus. I said, so is it painful lying on a bed of nails? He said, it's less painful than lying on one nail. It's a philosophy. But what interested me was the vulnerability of these delicate hairs on his ribs and all these blades like that. So sometimes it's the detail that is encouraging for the overall picture. It's not just the act itself. It's something tender that comes through. This was Ariel's babysitter. Not that you needed a babysitter, but when we went out, you needed someone. So this woman was the hostess at the bar next door, and one night she was just standing there on the bar, and the wind was blowing her hair, and I said, "Come on over, I'll make you a picture." So she came up the stairs, and when she reached the top, she just stood there, like waiting for me, and I saw the talon-like quality of her hands, and the wind blowing her hair, and I thought, this is it. I don't have to do anything else. I'll make this picture. And that is it. Thank you.
Aperture.